Will Arnett joins me in studio. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So this show is your baby. You created it. You star in it.
Yeah.
Why is this a story that you wanted to invest so much time and energy into?
For a number of reasons. First of all, I'd lived in Venice off and on over the years, and it's such a great place, and it's such a specific vibe out there.
It's a wonderful, weird place.
Wonderful, weird place. Yeah. And it's as my friend said last year, just sort of observing everybody walking around, he said, "What's the name of that band that everybody in Venice is in?" Because it does have this but it's a very tolerant place, and it lets people come there. Historically, it was a very kind of blue-collar town, and so rent was cheap. And if you were an artist and you came to Los Angeles, you could move there and get great space. And as a result, you had a lot of people who were doing lots of different things, and they would allow you to kind of be you. You could dress how you wanted. You could be how you wanted. So I always thought that it was a great place to set a show. I also like the idea of a guy who's a big fish in a small pond. I always think that that's a funny idea. And I remember observing a good friend of mine years ago in Venice and standing outside this old place that's still open, one of the original sort of coffee places there called Abbott's Habit, and various people walking by and going, "Yo, Pete, what's up?" And it seemed like homeless people or businessmen, he knew everybody. And I loved that. And so I wanted to, that was my first sort of, years ago, I was like, there's something here about this place.
About this place and about being a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the idea of reinvention, and the idea of somebody, you can go to a place like Venice and be whomever you want to be. And I think there are a lot of people who go there and they kind of create new identities for themselves. And certainly Chip is that. Chip is a guy who we don't really know what his backstory is, and we don't even really get into it in season one that much, his true backstory.
So let's get a sense of Chip. Tell me a bit about your character. So we find out right away he leads an AA type of gathering in Venice. He's a big fish. He's the guy on the block. He's a big fish in a small pond. What else? How else is he seen from the outside?
Well, he's the first scene you see he's leading an AA meeting, and the show's not about AA. I can't say that enough. Not because not that that's a bad thing. Just that we want to make sure that it's a story that everybody can relate to. And I think we say the words AA twice in the entire series, but it's about a guy who has changed his life, and so he's in AA. He is a guy who his story is very extreme.
Okay,
what he's overcome, and there is that sense of like, hey, yeah, like you can turn your life around, but this guy, his story is so hardcore, and yet he was able to recover from that. There must be something we can learn from him. And it's almost like the harder your story is, the more credibility you have. And he has created this, and he has this story that is pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
And then through that, he's been able to create this persona.
You talked about your love for Venice right at the outset. Where were you at in your life when you were in Venice?
Well, when I first moved to Venice 15 years, almost 16 years ago, I was newly sober. And I was a single man who was 30 or approaching 30. No, I was 30. And that was a real sort of transitional phase for me, and Venice was the perfect place for me to live at that time, because it allowed for me to kind of, there was never anybody sort of had putting any sort of pressure on you to be this or that. You could just kind of be who you wanted to be, and it was a great time for me to live there. And I lived there for a couple of years, and then I moved back to New York. I guess that first time I really lived there for a year in earnest, and then I moved back to New York, and then I came back.
Okay.
Sort of 3 years later, I find myself, I started shooting Arrested Development the first time around, and I got an apartment in Venice. Okay,
so you were in Venice at a point where you were 30, you were getting sober. So how much of this is informing the character of Chip, that whole experience?
A lot. We started to write this character of Chip. I first started kind of outlining my idea for the character. I was flying over to London. This is a couple years ago. And I was going to do something, and I was going to have dinner with my friend Mark Chappell, who co-wrote Todd Margaret with David Cross. And so I met him through David Cross, and Great guy, and I met him for dinner, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Like I said, I'd had this idea of writing something about Venice, and I wrote down Chip, and I sort of wrote a couple paragraphs and a few thoughts and ideas about him. And I went for dinner, and sort of near the halfway through dinner, I said to Mark, I've got this idea for this character. I don't know what it is. And I explained to him sort of my thoughts on Venice and how Chip might fit in there. And Mark had never been to Venice before as an Englishman. And we spent that weekend, we started to outline the idea for this story. And what I did was, for me, Chip was an embodiment of originally a lot of the things that I disliked, that I felt like I disliked in other people.
Okay.
He was a pathological liar. And at the time, I was so... I used to always feel this sort of sense of outrage at people who were dishonest with me, because that was such a, it's so hard to, when somebody's dishonest with you, it's so unnerving because you can't get any solid footing. Mm-hmm. And I was at a time in my life where that kind of dishonesty was really upsetting to me. But that was kind of 3 years ago, or I guess about 3 years ago, maybe 4, when we first started outlining the idea. Last year, we started to write the scripts. Mark and I did. I guess when I started to actually get into episodes, what started as something like an exploration or a condemnation of these traits in other people, it's impossible at this point for me to not start informing the character with traits or things from my own life, from my own experience. And it became a very difficult experience for me because I started confronting a lot of things I didn't like about myself.
Interesting.
And that made it was a much harder process than I thought it was going to be. Writing it was a lot darker than I thought it would be, and then ultimately shooting it too. And I don't think I realized it really until we were done what a difficult exercise it was.
I was just about to ask you if you felt like now was the time to do this because you had the distance, but it sounds like you weren't exactly aware of what you were going to be bringing up.
I really wasn't, and it ended up it became this kind of Pandora's box for me, in all honesty, and it's so funny to say in all honesty. We used to count how many times Chip say, to be honest, and we'd put them in and we'd try to add them to kind of layer it. But yeah, certainly I started noticing we were probably 4 episodes in writing, and I started to feel this kind of discomfort. But I had to kind of continue on, obviously, for a number of reasons. And then when we started to shoot, it became increasingly difficult. And it really started to, strike a chord. Not any one thing in particular, but just working in this place that was a very uncomfortable, confronting, certainly with the idea of my own kind of murky relationship over the years with sobriety, mm-hmm. and what that means. And not just sobriety, I mean like not drinking, but the idea of spirituality, and being totally having a complete sort of clean slate, spiritually and emotionally. And it became very difficult, and it was what ended up as being a difficult process, writing and then shooting, which was very difficult and exciting and challenging in ways that I hadn't been before, and then editing was the final, because I was constantly confronted with it on a daily basis.
Again. Yeah,
and making sure that we tell that story in the most honest way. And there were moments, when I'd watch where it would be kind of devastating, and I thought, I can't believe that I'm going through this process, but I've got to do it.
Wow. Was it hard to make all of that into comedy?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. Again, it is a comedy, and I'm sort of touching a lot on a lot of the sort of what kind of lies beneath the surface. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, my favorite kinds of comedies are the ones that resonate on an emotional level. My favorite film of all time is Withnail and I think it's brilliant because you actually see these guys going through something. And we use that, there are a lot of homages to that film in the show. Certainly on the surface, at the heart of the show is this male friendship, yes, between Chip and Dennis. And it was important for me to kind of tell a story of a male friendship that's not based around fantasy football and all this sort of BS that we see in popular culture, because that's not a true reflection of my relationships with my male friends. And I think that we live in an age where male friendships have evolved, and it's okay to speak in a very sort of real and an emotional way.
Were there critical male friendships for you at that time in your life?
Certainly, and I've over the years always had really critical male friendships. And when I first got sober, I had a lot of friendships that were very important to me, and I was able to speak very frankly with guys and be very honest in ways that I guess I hadn't been before. And since then, I've been lucky to have a lot of those friendships.
That's totally transformative.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Without question.
Is that part of what got you sober? Those friendships?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being able to rely on other men who had gone through what I was going through, to be able to lean on them and have them say like, "Hey, that's okay," Look, we live in an age where people are constantly on the move, and certainly I live or have lived at various times of sort of a nomadic lifestyle based on what I do, and it is because my family's not around all the time. I have a lot of friendships, and certainly a lot of male friendships that have been almost surrogate families to me, brothers, if you will.
That is how it is for a lot of people, I think, in their 20s and 30s, moving around a lot for career.
Yeah.
Friends can easily become family. Speaking of family, your Toronto days.
Yeah.
You're a Toronto kid.
I am.
When did you discover comedy? I want to just kind of tap into some early comedy memories for you in your Toronto days. What struck you as funny? What are some funny memories? Or who?
Or who? Yeah. I don't know. I guess I feel like comedy was always kind of one of those things that was ever present. I think that I probably myself used comedy as a way to avoid a lot of conflict.
When you were younger?
When I was younger, and I found it was a really great distraction from what was happening, which is another sort of theme I guess we explore in Flaked. I had the people that I looked up to, were people that I saw on TV.
Okay.
And whether, of course, I grew up watching SCTV, and a lot of, there's so many great Canadian comedians, comics, and comedic actors. I remember as a teenager, I was a huge David Letterman fan, and I'd stay up really late and watch Letterman every night, and those were the people who had the most influence on me. There was a kind of a wryness to Letterman, and yet he implored you to, even though he was silly, he was smart. And I always really, I wanted to be smart. I'm not suggesting that I am.
But at some point in your career, you stumbled upon this particular gift for comedy. I think a very specific gift where you take these flawed characters like Chip, and sometimes they're jerks, sometimes they're kind of dumb, sometimes they're both, and sometimes they're very complicated like Chip, but they're lovable.
Yeah, I guess, certainly with Arrested Development, I went to New York to be a dramatic actor. That was my first intention. I was young enough that I thought that it was, that I wanted people to take me seriously. And I kind of fell into comedy by mistake. I started reading for sitcoms and that sort of thing just because I needed to pay the rent. And it wasn't until a few years into doing that I realized it was something that I could actually do. I was too dumb to think about going to Second City, which I wish, in a lot of ways, I wish I had. And yet I'm not unhappy with the direction I went. But, Arrested Development was the first time that, in the character of Job, Mitch Hurwitz, who created Arrested and wrote it.
You're working with again.
Who executive produced the show. Yeah, we can't be apart. He and I, I remember early on when I was first, I didn't even have the job yet. We were just talking about Job. And what the real in for me was the idea of this son who had been passed over, who was kind of unloved, and he was desperate. He was just desperate to have some sort of validation from his family. And there was something about that I like, and I guess those are the characters that I'm drawn to. The characters who are deeply flawed on an emotional level, who have been scarred and hurt, and on the surface they are, like, as you say, they're jerks or whatever, but actually it comes from somewhere. That's my into it. Otherwise it's just nothing.
Was it right away that you discovered how to access the hurt in a character like Job?
I don't know if it was right away. I mean, it was certainly the way that Mitch writes. For whatever reason, I understood what he was going for. It was. I think, we discussed it, but there was also like this kind of unwritten. I think we kind of at the same time really just organically
found the heart of him.
Yes, found the heart of him and started moving in the same direction. And there were certain things that we found about Job that would make us laugh. Really, was always about making us laugh. I mean, all these things,
the stuff we're talking about sounds like a bummer, but I mean, it's hilarious.
It is hilarious. Well, because that's where the comedy lives, right? I mean, and like you were saying, super dumb. For me, I've always maintained that combination of super dumb and pretty cocky, and the cockiness is always making up for, the insecurity. That combination is like just a delightful tonic, I mean, it's just a great space to be in when you have a complete idiot who's like, no problem, I know how to drive this airplane. And you're like, do you? Of course I do. Like that's so funny to me, which is what makes me laugh kind of about what's happening in the presidential elections a little bit. I mean, I'm not political, but, watching Donald Trump talk about nothing, it's amazing. But yet he does it with such conviction. It makes me laugh.
Not unlike a Will Arnett character.
It really. It's just so funny to me. I know that I shouldn't laugh because the stakes are so high, and yet it's funny.
Unfortunately, I have to let you go to your next interview, Will, but you were great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.